In today's video, the latest book from literary heavyweight Rose Tremain, Madeline Thien's Booker shortlisted novel about the Cultural Revolution. Norwegian author Victoria Kielland writes about the USA's first female serial killer. Lottie Hazell's debut novel about a relationship and a breach of confidence. Queer Moldovan, Russian, Maori siblings in Greta and Valdin. To rest or exercise? That is the question in Katherine Brabon's Body Double. An under-18 girls boxing championship in Rita Bullwinkel's Headshot. Annie is dead, but how do her family deal with it? And the building of the Panama Canal in Christina Henriquez, The Great Divide. Hello and welcome to Gunpowder Fiction and Plot. My name is Scott. If you're new here, this is a channel where I review books, specifically new releases, literary fiction and global literature. I'm going to review a bunch of books, some great, some not so great. But firstly, I have a few pieces of housekeeping and news and stuff to tell you about. I get very jealous when I see the wonderful Booktuber catch-ups that are happening so regularly in London with some of my very favourite creators. So I had my own little mini catch-up with one of my favourite creators, Josh from Josh's Bookish Voyage. Josh was in Melbourne for a few days over Easter, seeing the sights and so on. And I'm pleased to say that I guess I'm one of the sights. We intended to catch up for lunch, but we talked so long we also caught up for dinner. He's a fantastic guy, and if you're not familiar with his channel, please check it out. I also promised I would react to the Booker International long list, and I haven't done that yet, and by now the shortlist has been announced. I'm sorry, I really intended to do a dedicated video, discuss the books one by one, but life, so much has been happening, and the truth is, I don't feel like I have the most insightful thoughts on that list. For what it's worth, this is what I think of the list. I had read the details prior to the announcement. I didn't like it. It bored me, and it was quite forgettable. I'm not surprised to see Selva Amada make the long and now the short list. She was one of the four big names I said that we could see on the long list, although I predicted that Olga Ravin would make it and she missed out. I really love the cover for A Dictator's Call. That's a brilliant cover. I am shocked that there is not a single French-speaking author on that long list. I love that we got an Albanian author. I love all the South American authors that made the long list. Having Venezuela, Brazil, Peru and Argentina all represented is fantastic. It is a pity that only one of them made it to the shortlist, but you know, you can't have your cake and eat it too. No Fitzcarraldo is a completely fair punishment for their absolutely horrid book covers. I know a lot of people love those plain blue book covers, but I just hate them. Very divisive topic, Fitzcarraldo covers, but I'm happy to agree to disagree if you love them. I also hate licorice and cauliflower, and no, burying either of them in cheese doesn't work. But we can still be friends if you eat those disgusting items, and we can still be friends if you like the blue covers. And despite the blue, I will acknowledge that Fitzcarraldo do produce some excellent books regardless of my dislike of their cover scheme. Well, enough general chatter. Let's actually talk about books that I have read. And as always, I'm going to start with my DNFs. I'm going to go from my worst book to my best book. I don't actually rank my DNFs. The DNFs are unranked. And I have 3 DNFs to tell you about, and I'm going to start with Lioness by Emily Perkins. Look at that cover. Just look at it. It's a brilliant cover. It's a pity the words in the novel weren't that engaging. This was really boring. It's about rich people being rich, and there's only so much of that I can tolerate before something interesting has to happen, because rich people are often boring and problematic. And this book was too slow to criticize them and didn't sow enough discontent. After Annie by Anna Quindlen. Annie dies in the first sentence of this novel, and we follow her family, particularly her preteen daughter and her husband. This book is Scott catnip, but it falls into the telling not showing category. The emotional writing just wasn't there, and I'm not really sure what the aim of this book was. I get the feeling that this author could write emotional writing if she wanted to, but that she maybe didn't want to. So I'm gonna have to put this down to this was just not the book I wanted it to be. And lastly, Broughtups by Christina Cooke. This is my last DNF, and I actually think that this is a potentially fantastic novel, but it was the wrong book at the wrong time for me. There are a lot of flashbacks in this at the beginning, And I got so confused, and I wasn't feeling the most intelligent when I started to read this, and I just decided to leave it and move on. This is about a woman who is returning to Jamaica after years of living in Canada to scatter her brother's ashes and catch up with her sister. There is some form of trauma, sisters with a broken relationship full of resentment and a feeling of abandonment. There are LGBT themes and that questioning of where is home that immigrants go through. I wasn't going to discuss this book at all. I do not tell you about all the books I DNF in these little wraps. Sometimes they're just too early to mention. And I'm absolutely not saying that this is a bad book by DNFing it. There is definitely potential for this book to be fantastic. I am really honestly saying that this was the wrong book at the wrong time, or maybe the right book at the wrong time. I'm not really sure how that cliche is meant to work. I'm bringing this up because I think that this is a book that quite a few of you might be interested in reading, and I just wanted to let people know that it exists. A really soft DNF, and this is the sort of book that I may very well come back to in 6 months or 12 months time. But also, caveat, there's a lot of books out there and that may not happen. On to the books I've finished. Do Not Say We Have Nothing by Madeline Thien. This is the first of 2 books I read for my Patreon book club. Even though this book was terrible, the discussion was really fantastic. And this is the perfect time in the video to thank my wonderful Patreons for their support and to welcome my newest members, Ashley, Kate, Sherry, Daniela, and Anna. Welcome to my Patreon. If you would like to join, I would really appreciate the support. Even when the book isn't great, the discussion is always fantastic and it makes up for the disappointing read. Also, know one thing, I don't DNF book club books. This is a book I would have DNF'd if I was reading it on my own, and I can see from the reviews this is a really polarizing novel, a love it or hate it book. This is a book about Chairman Mao's Cultural Revolution, student protests, Tiananmen Square, the suffering of people in China, classical music, and some weird book that is unfinished and may actually predict the future. This book has some major flaws. There are a lot of characters, a lot of different points of view, and they're all a bit the same. I don't know if that is intentional and a commentary on the conformity of what authoritarian communism does to individuals, or if it was poor writing. The thing is, regardless of whether it was a very intelligent criticism of Mao or bad writing, it makes the book less readable. It makes the book less enjoyable. There were also characters in this novel that didn't have their stories resolved. Again, is it a comment on the not knowing nature that living in China at the time was, or is it an oversight by the author? I don't think it matters. It again makes the book less readable and less enjoyable. I've had a while to ponder on this, and I think that the flaws are actually intentional. So it's almost definitely a case of this is what the author was intending, and this is not something that I personally like. The metaphors of a book telling the story and predicting the future, but also somehow telling what was happening in the past, I found that really tiring and boring. I kind of got it. Can we just move on? Foreshadowing the ending, we get it. Politically, this book, the criticism of communism is guilty of being like really generalized. It would have been better to stick to criticizing Mao's rule. I found it to be really simplistic. I personally don't agree that communism is evil. I do think that there are people such as Chairman Mao or Stalin and so on that are pretty horrible, despicable people, and they floated to the top in a lot of communist countries. And I think that looking at a system that enables that is far more thought-provoking and interesting than simply saying communism is evil. It's not just a political thing. I just think the labeling of things as good and evil is way too simplistic, and it removes motivation and a level of analysis that I really enjoy. Let's face it, nobody is good and nobody is evil. Everybody is a shade of grey, and we need that in our literature. My Men by Victoria Kielland, translated from Norwegian by Damion Searls. This is a book about the first female serial killer in the United States of America. And I think that that statement will get a lot of you interested. And that description is completely accurate. But yet I don't think this book meets your expectations. It's not the sort of book that you're expecting when you hear that. It is a book where at no point do we see a single murder. There is a disassociation with the act. I also expected that this might be like a nasty character study. And there was a little bit of meat there, but I really couldn't say that this was a character study. I also was thinking female serial killer. Maybe she's gotten really fed up with the men around her mistreating her and she snapped, and this would just be like a feminist rage novel. But that's not what this book was doing either. And I'm sort of left with the question of what was this book doing? And I don't really have an answer for you. One of the things I thought that was done really well was the language being very bombastic. At places it was almost confusing, and it really reflected Belle, our serial killer's mind. It was really varied, and that was quite interesting. This book is only 200 pages long, and it's not enough to cover the life of Belle Gunness. It is really missing in details. It could have been expanded quite a lot. I don't expect a blow-by-blow account of all of her murders. I mean, we honestly don't know how many people she even killed, but it kind of feels predictable. The final third of this book was almost like she married a man, he dies. She marries another man, he died. She married a third man, he died. Body Friend by Katherine Brabon. This is about a woman who is recovering from surgery. She meets two women. Frida at a local pool. They swim together, and Frida encourages her to come regularly to exercise with her and to get stronger. Later she meets Sylvia in a park, and she encourages her to rest in order to recover. We are given no detail of the surgery, and while we know it is an autoimmune disease, we the reader cannot make a judgment on who is correct, Frida or Sylvia. Both characters seem completely reasonable and also unwilling to listen to contradictions to their argument. This is told in first person, and it's a novel that, rather than being an exploration of the body, disability, healing and illness, I think it's much more about being the expert of our own body, our own experiences, and then seeing those experiences in somebody else. Our protagonist is not named, and she's a very passive character, but in Frida she sees somebody whose experiences are uncannily similar to hers, while in Sylvia she sees somebody who understands her pain and her frustration. Both women are advocating for what worked for them, and our protagonist seems to yo-yo between them, at first loving the influence of one of them, only to grow restless or exhausted and hover towards the other one. This story is almost ghost-like. It kind of reminds me of a stick wading in a river, unaware of which direction the current will take it next. The counteracting peer pressures these two women exert on our protagonists through caring show how these women value their own experience and project their own experiences on the protagonist. I'm really impressed that Brabon could write a book with so much interior monologue belonging to such a passive character and make it interesting enough for me to read to the finish. That statement, I guess, is a bit of a backhanded compliment, and I think you can read every bit of compliment and the backhand in that. This is a fantastically executed novel, but the vision is not my favourite. This is also a book that I would really recommend, if you do read it, to take your time with it. I didn't. I read a lot, and I do this by audiobooking when I'm completing other tasks. And I didn't take the time to ponder and let this book breathe. And there are some things that I didn't realise until after I finished this book. Frida and Sylvia are references to Carlo and Plath, being one such key example. Two famous women who have lived with chronic pain. And I cannot help but to think the book would have been improved if I understood that reference while I was reading instead of afterwards. This book was longlisted and it has since been shortlisted for the Stellar Prize. And this is a slow, reflective, internal novel that is very adjacent to what I like, but it's not completely my thing. And I've already said it. Fantastic execution, but the vision is not my favourite. Headshot by Rita Bullwinkel. This is a novel about 8 young women, teenage girls, competing in a boxing tournament. There are 7 fights, and each fight you learn a little bit more about the girls who are fighting. A lot of this is quite reflective, looking at what makes up the characteristics of these women, who they become years after the fight, why their fashion choices suit them, why they got into boxing, and of course then there's the fight. I cannot help but to think the purpose of this novel is to take a traditional male space and centre women in that space. But it's the choice of how these women are centred in the novel that is interesting. When I think about how women's sport is treated at large by society, I think of men saying things like, Serena Williams could never beat Andy Murray. Or I think about the uniforms of the Brazilian beach volleyball team, or those new workout bottoms that have that special seam right up the bum crack. It just underlines this completely unnecessary sexualization of women who are playing sport. And at the same time, constantly trying to compare them to men and make them seem inferior. But there's no admiration of skill, and there really isn't the seeing them as people. And that's what this novel is doing. It is humanizing these 8 athletes. It is seeing them as women, as people. And so we're not so much interested in who landed what punch and who won in how many rounds. We're actually interested in the backstory of these women who have taken up boxing. The Great Divide by Christina Henriquez. This is a historical fiction novel about the building of the Panama Canal. There are quite a few characters and subplots in this novel, and it has this feeling of being this epic, sprawling novel. But Henriquez has kept its length to that of a rather average book length, 320 pages. I would say that there are probably 2 major storylines here. Ada, a 16-year-old from Barbados who runs away from home with very few resources, hoping that she can land a job and send money back to save her sick sister. And then there is Marion and John. John is a US scientist studying malaria and hoping to find a cure, but quite a lot of this book is told from the point of view of Marion, his wife, and her difficulties adapting to life in Panama. These 2 stories obviously link in with each other sooner or later, and there's a lot of side characters who play their part in painting the picture of what life in Panama was like at the time, displaying class and racial divides. There is one scene that really stands out to me where a black woman is trying to buy medicine for her very ill white employer, and she goes to the gold pharmacist, not the silver pharmacist. And the pharmacist doesn't really care, but the scene that is created by one of the customers who is keen to uphold this divide, for me, that is the best scene in this book. I love the demonstration of unfairness and how that disadvantage also disadvantages the privileged group. There is another really strong scene with a worker towards the end of the novel who is desperately trying to meet a rather difficult quota. If you've read the book, you'll know the scene that I mean. A bit of a spoiler if I tell you what happens there. And this is a book that has some really, really strong scenes in it. And don't get me wrong with what I'm about to say. This is a good book, but it's a really frustrating book. It's a flat book with moments of brilliance that bring this novel alive. And I clearly don't understand the role of an editor, because this should be a remarkable novel that everybody is screaming about. And it would have been if only the editor would have said, look at what you've done here and here and here. Look at these iconic scenes. They're wonderful. Make the whole book this good. Because if the whole book is that good, we're talking book prizes. We're talking household names, millions of copies, Reese or Oprah signing the rights. But it's not strong enough between the amazing scenes. And as a result, rather than having a good book, you kind of have this meh book that is intermittently incredible. Absolutely and Forever by Rose Tremain. Rose Tremain, former winner of the Woman's Prize in 2008. This is a very simple coming-of-age novel about a young woman, Marianne, who at 15 falls in love with Simon, 18. This is a story we've all read before, and what I think Rose Tremain has done really well here is that we can tell Marianne is putting more faith in Simon than he deserves. But we don't know if he's going to come through and do the right thing by Marianne or be a bit of a cad. The other thing I like is that this is our starting point of the novel. It is one of these books where I can't tell you as much as I like for fear of spoilers. It's not overly plotty, but the resolution of what I have told you is well before the end of the novel. It's not an overly plotty novel, but the plot is really important for the character development. And that's what this book is. It's a wonderful coming-of-age character development novel. It is a simple novel, done really well. It is nothing amazing. It is just a talented author writing a good book. Read this one if you like character studies. Piglet by Lottie Hazell. Piglet, a terrible nickname she was given as a child, and Kit are about to get married, but Kit must unburden himself with a confession, throwing into question their entire relationship. Once unburdened, Kit manages to get to sleep, while Piglet stays up for the rest of the night. Lottie Hazell never discloses what Kit's transgression is, and that is really interesting, because it takes the focus off the act and places it upon the relationship. If Kit, for example, had have slept with somebody else, well, we all know somebody who has been cheated on before. We're going to bring those experiences to the novel. We know what we think about people who cheat. We're never judging Kit for what he did. We're judging him for how he makes Piglet feel. We're judging him for how he acts after he's made this transgression. Honestly, this doesn't have to be cheating. It could easily be a gambling addiction. He could secretly vote Tory when Lottie is a lefty. He might enjoy fox hunting or be HIV positive. We just don't know. With the wedding rapidly approaching, Piglet is forced to make a quick decision and decides to continue with the wedding. But it becomes very clear that she needs time to process what has happened, what Kit has said. And she needs that time, ideally, without the stress of planning a wedding. And this is where we start to see cracks in Piglet's and Kit's relationship. We start to see the manipulation, not just from Kit, but also from his family. We see this growing pressure for normality, this pressure to forgive, this pressure on Piglet to put Kit's needs in front of her needs. And we see this need for an instant resolution, and Kit holding Piglet to what she has said. There is a lot of food associated with this book. The UK cover has a burger on it. The US cover has donuts on it. Piglet is the editor of a cookbook at a London publishing house. She has a fixation for food. It is something she loves, but it is also a safe place, a place of control. She has an eating disorder, binge eating. I love seeing the opposite of anorexia or bulimia in a novel. Food is such a massive part of our life, and it's really puzzling to me that eating disorders, be that eating too much food or not eating enough, isn't far more common than it already is, and I know it's pretty common at the moment. It's something that we must have a relationship with. We all need to eat. The best part of this book is that when we look at the two relationships Lottie Hazell has spent so much time writing about, Piglet's relationship with Kit and Piglet's relationship with food, core relationships in Piglet's life, there's a commonality of not getting what she needs. Will Piglet take Kit's last name? Her first name has already been changed due to her other relationship in this book. I thought that this was a delightful and intentional mess of a book. Piglet was so easy to like. The emotional manipulation this book puts you through is perfectly done. It may be a little bit light on the discussion, but I think that this is a really good, solid 4-star novel. And the last book in this video, and by far the best book in this batch, is Greta and Valdin by Rebecca K. Reilly. I loved this book. It is about a queer brother and sister living together. Valdin was a physicist, and he was in a long-term relationship with family friend Catalonian Jabby, who has recently left Auckland and started his own life in Buenos Aires. That was 12 months ago, and now Valdin's new job is sending him to Argentina to film something. 6 years younger than her brother, bisexual PhD student Greta has an unrequited crush on a co-worker. She's considering returning to men for a bit as she thinks they're less complicated, and she's concerned that of all the women on the apps that she is swiping on, she's starting to see repeats. Then she meets a woman and must figure out all of her feelings, while at the same time being broke and without her best friend and flatmate who is not answering his phone while he's travelling to Argentina. There is also a third older sibling whose teenage son seems to be having his own gay crisis and is seeking Valdin for advice, but he needs to settle for Greta. I love these three siblings. One straight, one gay, one bisexual. A Russian by way of Moldovan father and a Maori mother, and the whole family have Catalonian links. There are identities here that I know you will have never read about. I certainly haven't. This novel is quite funny. I really enjoyed the uncomfortable conversation between Valdin and his nephew towards the end of the novel, where Valdin says, "You can ask me anything about being gay," and the nephew promptly asks him if arse eating is really a thing and if he enjoys it. That's, yeah. Also, the older brother married somebody who was also called Greta, and she is forever called the other Greta. This is a book about family, both blood and chosen family. It is about love. It is a book about queer and racial identity that doesn't contain a lot of homophobia or racism in it. And while it is still there, it feels like these identities are discussed in a much more celebratory way. And that has been utilised by Rebecca Reilly to create so many characters that are just so easy to fall in love with. It really isn't our title characters, Greta and Valdin. The father is brilliant. Shabby is so easy to like, and Greta's new girlfriend. May all my single lesbian viewers out there find somebody as awesome as her. A literary romantic comedy. This is intelligent, funny, and just a really good time. The blurb of this book says that it is for fans of Schitt's Creek and normal people, and I just don't know how a blurb can simultaneously be so right and so wrong at the same time. This is a deep exploration of relationships done really well with a great slice of comedy thrown in. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.